This a mimer again, like I mentioned with Tafshin Yadalit, Lahavin in Yanadarim. The Rebbe begins it not with a pasuk, but just to understand the general concept of vows. The Lachura, seemingly, we need to understand about vows in general. This doesn't correspond in the Isa be Rishalmi, what is brought down in Rishalmi. Isn't it sufficient for you in what the Torah prohibited? Why are you going ahead and making a vow? If the Torah already prohibited enough things for you, you don't have to add to that, to those prohibitions by making a vow. This is the general idea of vows, that a person prohibits things that were permitted to him, that the Torah did not make it prohibited for him. Also, we need to understand in the details of the idea of the vows. That a vow is specifically said in speech. When one says a vow by connecting it to something else, when he has to be in something that can, the other thing that he's comparing it to has to be in something that is able to be made a vow. It's actually learned from the pasuk. It says each ki yidor neder. Why does it say a double lashon? Each ki yidor neder. What's the double lashon? That when a person makes a vow by comparing it to something else, so it needs to be something else that was also permitted and made prohibited, as we'll soon show the examples of it. The kasher oimer harei like a basar nevela shu asur mitzadat Torah. When a person says, "Let this kosher piece of meat be to me like a non-kosher piece of meat," lo yamar klum. It has no validity. It has no power of a vow because it's not a davar hanadar. Just like this non-kosher meat is not something that I can make prohibited. It was prohibited of its own. The same thing, when I make a vow, it's something that's permitted that I'm making prohibited. So I can't compare it and say it should be like a basar nevela. Rather, only when he grasps it, called. In other words, he's comparing it to something that could be made prohibited through a vow, through a statement. How does it work? Like a carbon. When a person says, "Let this piece of meat, this kosher meat that's lying here, be upon me like a carbon." A carbon is not essentially prohibited to a person. It only became prohibited because a person spoke and designated it as a carbon. So when I compare the piece of meat on my plate and I say I should be as prohibited to me as a carbon, then the neder is applicable. So now the Rebbe asks, with Tzarech L'Havin, we need to understand this Maimer Chazal. A vow is not like a carbon. The isuram. Why they dibur ha'adam. Though their common denominator between them is both become prohibited through a person's speech. A person designates something as a carbon, that makes it prohibited. And when I say that this thing is prohibited upon me like a carbon, that also makes it prohibited. So that's the common denominator. But they are still very different. The carbon, while is still a carbon, is about elevation of something. The betchila chulin, initially, the carbon was something that was chulin, it was mundane. Now the carbon becomes sanctified. As opposed to a vow, that's a descent. The betchila is a heter. Initially, before I made the vow, this item was permitted. A person could have done with it the avodah of refining and elevating the sparks, the service of his creator. Now it's now prohibited. If so, it's a descent. The opposite of a carbon, where it's an ascent. Here, you lowered it, you closed it off from being able to be elevated. Also, we need to understand what a sage can permit and make a neder allowed. How does a chacham do so? A chacham does so also by his speech. What's the strength? Why is the speech of the chacham more powerful to undo the speech that made it into a vow initially? That the speech of the chacham has the capability to release the prohibition that was created through the speech of the vow. Second paragraph on the page. All this will be understood by first prefacing the root, the source of the whole idea of things that are prohibited versus things that are permitted. The Isser, who Masha Kosher, V'asr B'de'achitzoynim, Isser is from the word bound up, that it's bound and imprisoned in the external ones in clip, and therefore it cannot be elevated, it cannot be used. The heter, the word heter is from the word release, like releasing a knot. U'masha mutter, it's released, V'eina kosher chulu, it's not bound up. K'mevur b'tani barichas, like the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya at length in chapter 7. Now, the Rebbe points out a very important point. When you say the term released, that means that it relates to being bound up. It's not completely out of the entire category of something that's bound up. So he's saying, from the fact that we say that heter is something that's not bound, it's not tied up, it's understood from this, also that which is released and permitted has some association to the external ones, to the klippos. It falls into the general category of having to do with klippos, but it's not bound up with klippos. And the Rebbe explains why. If it has no connection with klippos whatsoever, it's not possible to say it's not bound up, because the whole idea of binding and tying up is not applicable to it. Moving from the fact that we call it a heter, released, not bound, it's understood also what's permitted is in this category. It's not bound up. So too it will be understood in the roots of what is prohibited and permitted. The Isser Sharshe Megimel Klippus Atmeis Lagamri. That's something that's prohibited, its root, a non-kosher item, for example, its root is from the 3 impure klippos, completely impure. The Heter Sharshe Klippus Noiga. That which is permitted, that is its root is from Klippus Noiga. Kimavur Sham Tanya, like over there, Tanya explains. Hare Klippus Noiga Shayich Umemutzel Gimel Klippus Atmeis. It's also a klippa. Klippus Noiga has an association, and it's an intermediary, as we know, between the Gimel Klippus Atmeis and Kedusha. So he says, in what way does Klippus Noiga work as an intermediary? Hine kol in Yona Olam, all matters of the world, befrat in Yona Het, especially permitted matters, it always flows into them the godly power. To bring them into being, when their entire existence is only the godly life force, the power of the doer in the thing that's being done. The Kedusha, in Kedusha, the power of the maker, of the doer, the power of Hashem is revealed. It's revealed and it's recognizable that their entire existence is the godly life force. On the other hand, the klippos, Zebehelam and klippos, that's concealed. It's not recognizable, the godly vitality, and they are separated from godliness. Between Kedusha and Klippa, these are 2 extremes. There needs to be an intermediary between them. Who Klippas Noiga, top of page 155, the intermediary between them is Klippus Noiga. The Klippus Noiga ain't a Nikra Chais Begoli. True. Klippus Noiga shares that common denominator with Shlosh Kvat Meis, that the Chais is not recognizable in a revealed way. Omnam Eineva Pirud, still in all, it's not in a state of separation. And because it's not completely separated from godliness like Shlosh Kvat Meis is, through that, it's an intermediary between holiness and the Gimel Klipsat Meis. Therefore, going back to what we were talking about before, that we were saying that things that come from Klippus Noiga are called heter, they're released. Released means that it has some association with being locked up and bound up. So based on what we just now explained, that Klippus Noiga is an intermediary between Kedusha and Gimel Klipsat Meis, so therefore we can understand how heter, which comes from Klippus Noiga, has an association with the Isser, with the Chitzonim still, to a certain degree. Vim Kain Movin, if so it's understood, Shagam Hu Begeder, that also the Klippus Noiga, the permitted things, is also in the same general category that has to do with Klippus. But Klippus Noiga is not separated like Gimel Klipsat Meis. On the other hand, it's also not like Kedusha that has the revelation of godly life in it.